Hi everyone, welcome back to our podcast. Today we will be talking about something that's often misunderstood but also incredibly important: depression. Now, before we get into the causes or the treatments, I want to ground us in what depression actually is because a lot of confusion starts right there. The word depression comes from the Latin deprimere, which literally means to press down. And that's actually a very accurate way to describe the whole experience. People often don't just feel sad, they feel weighed down. Like there's this constant emotional pressure they can't escape. So, clinically, depression or major depressive disorder is defined as a condition where someone experiences persistent low mood, loss of interest in activities, and a range of emotional, cognitive, and physical symptoms for at least 2 weeks. But here's something really important: depression is not just sadness. So, let me ask you all, why do you think people often confuse the two so much?
It's because sadness is something everyone can relate to. Like if you fail an exam or like have a bad day, you feel low, but it passes.
Exactly. Depression doesn't just pass, it persists. And more importantly, it interferes with how you function. So, in psychology, we actually treat depression as a diagnostic construct, which means it is not identified by a single test like a blood test, but by a structured set of symptoms. It can exist at different levels as a symptom like low mood, and as a syndrome, which is a cluster of symptoms, or as a full disorder when it meets its clinical criteria. And diagnosis depends on three things: how long it lasts, how severe it is, and how much it disrupts your daily life. Now, another key point: depression does not just exist in isolation. It often comes with what we call comorbidities, meaning it co occurs with other conditions. So, Tivashini, would you mind explaining on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, Wazira. So, depression is very commonly seen alongside anxiety disorders and also physical illness like diabetes or heart disease.
And what's really interesting is that the relationship goes both ways. For example, someone with chronic illness may develop depression due to stress or pain, but at the same time, depression can reduce your motivation, making it harder to manage that illness, which worsens the overall condition. So, now that we understand what depression is, the next big question is, why does it happen? So, can you walk us through the cognitive perspective, Tivashini?
Oh, yeah. So, one of the most influential theories is called learned helplessness that developed by Seligman. And it originally started with experiments where animals were exposed to stress they couldn't escape. Over time, they stopped trying to escape even when escape later became possible. So now when this was applied to humans, the idea was that if someone repeatedly experiences situations where they feel they have no control, they may start believing that nothing they do matters.
So, it's not just about bad things happening, but it's about feeling powerless.
Exactly, Vasira. And that feeling of powerlessness leads to symptoms like low motivation, passivity, and withdrawal, which are very similar to depression. Let me give a simple example. Imagine a student who consistently studies really hard, but he keeps failing exams. At first, they try harder and try different strategies, but after repeated failure, they may start thinking, what's the point? Or nothing I do will change the outcome, and eventually they stop trying altogether. That's learned helplessness in action. But the theory was later refined with something called attribution theory, which looks at how people explain negative events. People who are more vulnerable to depression tend to explain failure in three main ways. Firstly, they use internal attribution, where they believe the failure is their fault. Second, they use stable attribution, meaning they think the situation will never change. And finally, they use global attribution, where They believe failure affects every area of their life.
So it's like turning one bad event into a whole identity.
Exactly, Labiba, you're right. For example, failing one test becomes I'm a failure in everything. And what's even more interesting is that neuroscience research suggests that the brain might actually default to assuming no control, and we have to actively learn control. So if someone experiences prolonged stress, they can essentially unlearn that sense of control which contributes to depression.
That leads really well into the next part. So, what do you think depression actually looks like, Labiba?
Yeah, so depression shows up in multiple areas, not just emotions. Okay, let's try to break it down. First of all, we have emotional wise. So people might feel persistent sadness, emptiness, hopelessness, or even emotional numbness. So one key symptoms of this is apnodia. It means that like it's the loss of interest in things that used to bring joy. So, like a very good example of this is like people losing their interest in the stuff they used to like. So, for example, if someone who used to love music might stop listening to it entirely. And then we also have cognitive wise, where depression affects thinking and negative thought patterns, self blame, stuff like difficult concentrating, or like even trouble making decisions. So these kind of things in severe cases can induce thoughts about death and suicide. Behaviorally, people may withdraw from others, stop engaging in activities, or like show reduced motivations. So when it comes to these aspects, people you can like kind of tell that people might stop attending like classes, for example, or stop replying to messages, just become withdrawn. And of course, we also like can see how depression affects physically, like the main thing like people know about is like sleeping problems, so it's either too much sleep or too little sleep. And then we also have appetite changes, constant fatigues, and body aches, so it really does affect the whole person.
And what about social or environmental factors?
Yes, so those are really important too. Depression is influenced by social and ecological factors like stressful environment, lack of support, financial struggles, and even obviously social isolation. So, for example, someone living in a high pressure academic or like working environment without support may gradually develop depressive symptoms.
That's a really interesting take. This brings us to a more critical perspective. So, Annie, do tell us, are we looking at depression too medically?
Yeah, this is where the idea of demedicalization comes in. So, traditionally, depression is treated as a medical disorder, but demedicalization suggests we should also see it as a response to life circumstances like stress, trauma, or social inequality. So, instead of asking what is wrong with the person, we also ask what has happened to the person.
That's a big shift from what I know.
Yes, and there are several criticisms of medicalization. First, there's a rise in depression diagnoses globally, even though access to mental health care has improved. Second, there's limited evidence that depression is purely caused by a chemical imbalance. Third, medications may sometimes mask symptoms rather than address underlying causes.
So, treatment without context might not actually solve the root issue.
Yes, that's why frameworks like the power threat meaning framework suggest that symptoms are actually logical responses to life threats like financial stress or social pressure.
Now, let's move into a really sensitive but important topic, ethics.
One major issue is autonomy, especially in relation to suicide and medical assistance in dying. Globally, suicide is one of the leading causes of death among young people, and depression significantly increases this risk. Now, the ethical question is, should individuals with depression have the right to choose death?
That's really complicated. What a tough decision to make.
Very, because depression can affect decision making capacity. So, even if someone says they want to die, the question is, are they in the right state of mind to make that decision rationally? Different countries handle this differently. Some do allow assisted dying under strict conditions, while others prohibit it entirely.
And there's also the broader question, should we be fixing individuals or changing the society?
That's the core of bioethical debate. Do we treat depression as something inside of the individual that needs to be fixed? Or do we address the social systems that contribute to it, like inequality, pressure, and lack of support? Because in many regions, especially in Southeast Asia, suicide prevention focuses on improving living conditions, such as access to housing, healthcare, and social support.
Okay, with that, we've seen that depression is not just one thing. It's not just sadness, not just biology, or not just mindset. It's a complex interaction between thoughts, experiences, biology, society, and even meaning and identity. So, a big thank you to Tivashini, Labiba, and Annie for such an insightful discussion. And to our listeners, if you or someone you know is struggling, reaching out is a strong first step. So, we'll see you guys in the next episode. Take care.